Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I'm talking about cosmic synths, a little bit of jazz, the modern bass guitar, and Tom Jenkinson's pink shirt. Yes, it can only be Hello Everything, released in 2006 on Warp Records, coming out 2 years after the challenging and ambitious Ultravisitor. It is Squarepusher's 8th album. Now, at half the length of its predecessor, and cased in a brightly coloured sleeve, decorated with cheerful photos of Tom wearing that lovely pink shirt and playing various instruments, both traditional and electronic, it presented a much more accessible packaging of the Squarepusher product. Like Ultravisitor, it brought together live instruments as well as digital programming, but here presented in a much more straightforward and glossy fashion. I would hesitate to say that it is Squarepusher goes pop, but it does feel a little bit like Squarepusher for beginners. Indeed, the kitsch treatment of the album cover art almost feels like something from a kind of retro instruction manual. None of that is meant as a criticism, don't get me wrong. This is still a Squarepusher album, so be assured you are in for some challenging and experimental electronic music, not to mention a fair few bangers. But after the ambitious and sprawling Ultravisitor, Hello Everything could be seen as a bit of an attempt to go back to basics. Not that the music itself is basic, but if Ultravisitor was Tom Jenkinson following his creative urges as far as they would go, leading to some pretty weird and far out places, then Hello Everything, in a sense, reins all that in and ties everything back together again. So the album almost feels like a Squarepusher retrospective, drawing on elements from all of his previous work without expanding into new territory. Kind of like a best-of compilation, just one that only features new material. The result is a compact release with generally tight track durations and pieces that tend to explore one idea in a succinct fashion. Jazz is applied like a tasteful adornment around the edges, rather than the never-ending fractal improvisations of Ultravisitor, and even the breakbeat-driven tracks are restrained and punchy, as if they have been lifted out of that dank and murky world that Ultravisitor existed within and placed in a brightly lit room decorated in neon colours with a plastic finish. So let's get into the details. An opening track, Hello Meow, is kind of like the journey to freedom of the album. Opening with a squelchy acid bass line and brisk, if somewhat tinny beats, it is a straightforward hook which makes way for one of Squarepusher's classic uplifting melodies. I spoke in my video on Hard Normal Daddy, linked below, about how his melodies can often have this feeling that evokes to me being in suburbia with a very kind of nostalgic edge, very kind of homey feeling. This feels like an evolution of that. And the plasticky synth is retro too, and the refrain has this kind of everyman feel, like it's almost like the soundtrack to someone's entire life, but condensed into a 3.5-minute pop song. That all slots into place with the introduction of xylophones and that old familiar friend, the Amen break. And then just to make sure we are definitely listening to a Squarepusher track, we are treated to a quick bass solo before the melody gathers itself for that final climax. Tom flexes the beats a bit harder on Planetarium with some tightly chopped amens, a menacing bass line and cosmic synth. The beats are very pleasingly edited, but much more restrained and linear than on the previous two albums. It's almost as if his aim here is not so much experimenting with the form, but rather using the results of past experiments to just lay down some slick tracks. The melodic component is unapologetically spacey, feeling like the soundtrack to a lavish space opera, and moves with the gravity-defying energy of a craft flying through space. Nothing whatsoever to dislike here, as far as I'm concerned. Bubble Life and Theme from Sprite are two jazzier pieces that fill out the first half of the album. Again, far more restrained than anything on Ultravisitor, and far more accessible than the arrhythmic tangle of music as rotted one note. Indeed, the plucked acoustic guitar and the jaunty bass on Theme from Sprite put it somewhere between the reflective pieces on Ultravisitor and the funkier end of Rotted, but altogether sunnier and more carefree than either. The album is then divided in two by an ambient piece, Vacuum Garden, which doesn't do anything much apart from simply build anticipation ahead of the second half of the album. Circle Wave 2, which opens the latter half, is presumably a sequel to Circle Wave off Ultravisitor. But again, in keeping with the brighter disposition of this album, it takes the same elements, drums and acoustic instruments, but rather than the mournful tenor of the original, we are treated to a short exercise in dramatic tension. As an acoustic guitar melody resolves itself out of a fog of suspense, Rather than the anguished climax that the original has, we instead get a strong sense of relief, almost as if a foreboding presence has been somehow bested without the need for confrontation. After the brief palate cleanser of Kronecker King, Rotate Electrolyte feels like the start proper of the second half of the album. Chopped breaks, punctuated by a staccato bass drum, rave sirens, and flecks of acid bass build a pleasingly menacing atmosphere. Itself is a track of two halves, and about 2.5 minutes in, Tom breaks things down and rebuilds the track layer by layer with the addition of soothing pads and twinkling synths. Like Planetarium, it is much more linear and restrained than recent work, but also far more accomplished than, for example, the acid breakbeat jams on Selection 16. There are plenty of highlights to be found sprinkled all the way across Hello Everything, but one of the strongest and easily the most instantly memorable tracks, for me anyway, is Welcome to Europe. The opening acid bass and breakbeat combo is like a slicker redo of Vic Acid off Hard Normal Daddy, but it is the melody which really drives the energy of the track, and Tom once again indulges his penchant for the cosmic. It soars and swoops, painting a story in the sky like a conductor's baton. I don't know if the title is a nod to Tangerine Dream or other European cosmiche artists, but it certainly gives you the feeling of soaring in a spacecraft with the continent illuminated below like a carpet of twinkling lights. At the harder end of the spectrum, the modern bass guitar could almost be a track off Go Plastic. The beats don't fuck around on this one, with a refreshingly robust punch, and Tom's bass guitar is fed through a MIDI converter, so his playing is actually triggering computer-generated elements of the track rather than the sound of an actual bass guitar, hence the title being a jokey reference to the modern bass guitar. Then you've got a track, well, not following that, but prior to that, Plotinus fulfills the promise of Ultravisitor's synthesis of live instruments and digital programming. Jerky guitar solos jive with jittery breaks in a way that may be more satisfying to anyone who found Ultravisitor too impenetrable and sprawling a record, not me personally. The album ends in an odd fashion with Orient Orange, which is an extended 10-minute piece of arrhythmic drums and moody atmospheres. I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've actually played it all the way through, but listening to it again in preparation for creating this video, I can say it undeniably creates a vibe. Moody, sparse, and occupying that same post-apocalyptic world that Ultravisitor existed in. But it really doesn't sit with the atmosphere of Hello Everything, which is why I always tended to skip it. The CD version that I purchased many years ago came with a bonus disc, a little 3-inch CD, containing 5 ambient pieces, essentially titled Melts 1 to 5. I probably played this disc all the way through, because the pieces simply consist of extended tones with no interesting features whatsoever. I wouldn't even call them drones, because drones, I guess, have at least a harmonic component and a sense of progression, whereas the Melt tracks, to be honest, don't really do anything whatsoever. I'm sure I read an interview with Squarepusher back in the day, many years ago, where he proclaimed something to the effect that he would never create ambient music because he didn't agree with the ethos behind it and thought it was just wallpaper music that you put on to colour the emotional background of the room. For what it's worth, I don't think that's a fair assessment at all of ambient music, and there is plenty of ambient music that you can put on which is deeply moving and engaging. But to be fair, Tom was probably quite young when he made those comments, and they may well have been taken out of context. So let's not read too much into those. I wouldn't even really call the Melt tracks ambient anyway, although they are beatless. They are just, they just don't create any sort of atmosphere other than the sense that you might be near some electrical equipment. Experimental might be a better term, I guess, but not an experiment worth repeating in my view. On reflection, I think Hello Everything makes sense given where it sits in Squarepusher's discography. I remember when it came out feeling like it was a little bit of a step backwards after the visionary experiments of Ultravisitor, but returning to melody and returning to accessibility in a sense needn't be seen that way. And listening to it a lot in preparation for creating this video, I realised I had been neglecting it a little bit in recent years and will definitely be playing it more in future. While I will always rate Go Plastic and Ultravisitor higher, there are some absolute bangers on here, and it is one of Squarepusher's most consistent albums. It's also the perfect place to start if you are newer to his work. Anyway, that is it from me on Hello Everything. I'd love to hear what you think about this album, and if you're still watching the video at this point, please give it a like, and please check out my channel for more of the same. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.